Have you ever met someone that initially you had a good impression of them, and then you got to know them more? No names, just wondering. You ever meet someone, again, the first impression, but once you get to know more about them, it doesn't continue in that same way. You got to know them too much, maybe. You know, it sort of reminds me of the old saying, it's better to keep silent and be thought a fool than to speak up and remove all doubt. Don't let them know too much. Well, certainly this isn't possible about when it comes to God and Jesus. You know, we can't know them too well, right? Well, the answer to that is definitely no. Our goal is to know them. That's the goal of the Christian life. In John 17:3, Jesus describes eternal life. He says, this is eternal life, that they know you, God the Father, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. Which that right there, we could spend all kinds of time on that. This is eternal life. Not just to be forgiven, have your sins forgiven, but to know God, to know Jesus, and not just forever in heaven, but starting now, to know Him as much as well as possible. But is there a sense, our question that's going to guide us today, is there a sense in which we can be too familiar with Jesus or too familiar with God? This passage that we're going to look at in Mark 6 raises that question, and it's one that we all need to be concerned with, because for many of us in this room, we've known Jesus and known God for a long time. Is it possible to be too familiar with Jesus? To be familiar in such a way or to such a degree that it keeps us from knowing Him? What's the difference there? What might that be? Again, what is this potential danger that is there for people, not talking about people who don't know Jesus, people who know Him well, at least in some way? It's what we're going to see here in Mark, and it's what I want us to think about this morning. Mark chapter 6, verse 1 says, He, Jesus, went away from there and came to His hometown, and His disciples followed Him. And on the Sabbath He began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard Him were astonished, saying, Where did this man get these things? What is this wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph, and Mary and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about among the villages teaching. Now, I think you've heard me mention this idea of a wait a minute moment as you're reading through a passage of Scripture. And it's just what it sounds like. You're reading through and you wait a minute. And, you know, how does this fit with maybe something else in the passage? Or how does this fit with something in another passage? Or in this case, and oftentimes in a narrative, the wait a minute is you're moving along and things don't go the way you expect them to. Something unexpected happens as the progression is going along, as the story is being told. And really, that's the mark of a good story. And realize when we talk about, Bible stories, it doesn't mean they aren't true. It just means that's what's included in the Bible, are stories that have this element. I'm sure there were many times that Jesus walked and sat down by the fire and warmed His hands. But that wouldn't be much of a Bible story, would it, if that's what it was? There has to be something that we can gain from that. And so the things that are included have these elements. Well, did you see the one here? And the other thing about this is you have to be careful with the wait a minute moment, especially this kind of unexpected thing, because if you know the story, in one sense, it's not unexpected, isn't it? Well, I knew that was going to happen. I've heard the story before. But you try to put yourself in the sense of reading it for the first time, of reading it as it happened then. And to me, the wait a minute moment was the second part of verse 3. Where after these people had said, how amazing His teaching is and how powerful the works that He has done, it says they took offense at Him. Well, why would they take offense at Him? Why is that there? And so that's really the focus of what we're going to look at today. Why did these people take offense at Jesus? And what can we gain from that? What warning is there for us? What lesson is there for us? Well, let's go back and look through the passage. It says He went away from there. And what it is, that is picking up where we left off last week. And in fact, this whole section here, it began back in Mark 4 with the parables. Jesus taught those parables, you remember, he was in a boat on the edge of the sea, and the people were on the shore. Well, he didn't even go back to the shore. They took off across the sea. In the middle is where they had the storm that Jesus calmed. Then he lands on the west side, on the Gentile side, and he heals that man of the demons that lived in the cemetery, but the people beg him to depart. So he leaves from there, and he goes to what seems like Capernaum, where we saw last week he healed the man and raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. Well, he is now left there, and he's come to his hometown. And so all these things are connected, and we're going to see that as we look at the context, and keep all of those in mind as we begin to examine this and ask this question, why'd they take offense? So he comes from there to his hometown. Mark doesn't tell us, but we know that's Nazareth. And his disciples followed him. And I looked at that and I thought, okay, is there anything significant there? And not so much for what we're looking at this week, but the next passage is where Jesus sends out his disciples. And they've been following him ever since he called them, and that was part of the plan, remember? He said, I'm going to send you out to preach, but it's after they'd been with him for a while. So it's making this point. They're with him. They're picking up all this. Verse 2, and on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue. It was their custom that a visiting teacher would be asked to teach. And many who heard him were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? What is this wisdom given to him? And that should remind us of the first time that Jesus taught. And the people were just amazed. He didn't teach like the other scribes that seemed to just like quote people. Well, Rabbi so-and-so says this and so-and-so. And Jesus says, this is this. This is what it means. This is what God is saying. He spoke with authority. And then also, how are such mighty works done by his hands? Now, it doesn't tell us that he had done any miracle prior to this, but maybe he had done something in Nazareth prior. He's going to do a few things while he's there. But if not, they had definitely heard about him. We know word has spread, and we're going to see that in the next section as well. Herod's heard of him. Everyone has heard of Jesus and the things he's done. Then verse 3, the tone shifts a little. Is not this the carpenter? Well, we remember Jesus' earthly father Joseph was a carpenter, and apparently Jesus, as was the common trait in that time, the son would take on the profession of the father. Well, Jesus worked as a carpenter for a while. The son of Mary, doesn't say the son of Joseph, so most people assume Joseph had passed away by this point. Maybe he was older than Mary. And then the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon. And every indication, brothers, and they mention sisters, plural, don't give their names, but more than one sister. Every indication is these were children that Joseph and Mary had after Jesus was born. And we do know about James and Judas. They become followers of Jesus. James becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem and writes the book of James. Judas writes the book of Jude. And then Jesus said, and then they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor. A prophet was honored in this culture, and really other cultures, even false religions, the false prophets were honored there. Well, same thing, certainly among Israel, a prophet was honored, but then he says, except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. And it seems like maybe this is some kind of saying that was, there's not a Bible verse he's quoting. It's just the idea of a saying. It's a little bit like today, familiarity breeds contempt. It's that idea of, around the people who know me, they just don't view you the same way. And so that's what Jesus is talking about. A prophet is honored everywhere, except where he's known the best. And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about among the villages teaching. And I think that last verse, what it's telling us is he wasn't, the people didn't want him there. They certainly didn't honor him as a prophet. They didn't respect him and his ministry. And so he went to other villages, taught there, and everything we've seen says wherever else he taught, they did recognize, wow, and they accepted it more. Now, they were always focused on the physical, but even that, wherever he went to teach, he would he would heal and he would do other things too. And so it's just showing, wow, the people in Nazareth, they missed out. Not like the Gerasenes. They missed out on what could have been because of something, because of this idea of taking offense at him. Well, I want us to look at this today, and I went through this passage recently for a video training I did, and just going through it, it's going to be a lot like the way we did a couple Sunday nights ago with that passage. I want to ask these questions and find out this answer. What's this passage about? Why did they take offense? What's the lesson for us? And so the thing to look at is we dig into this passage and look for some key verses. What are the things that really stand out? Well, obviously the main one is that wait a minute moment. They took offense at him. And that word offense, it literally means a snare. Something a person would use to catch an animal by the foot, the leg. And so metaphorically, it means to stumble or to be tripped up, caught up by something. And so, the people there in Nazareth were tripped up by something. Well, again, what was it? What was it about Jesus that tripped them up? Verse 5, it definitely stands out. It says he could do no mighty work there. Well, was it because he just didn't have the power? He needed the energy. What is it? We believe, and so the fairies have power. That was like Peter Pan or something, wasn't it? Yeah, see, I knew that. Well, it was like, they didn't believe, and so his power, no. He couldn't do in the sense of it didn't fit his purpose. It was enough that he'd go to these other places and the people would rather have miracles than teaching, but they still were open to the teaching and open to things and what the miracles said about him, who he was from God. They weren't here, and so he only did a few things. Maybe for some people who did believe in him, did have some element of openness to him. And then verse 6, he marveled because of their unbelief. Well, we've talked about, I think it was last week, this idea that, it's the same word in Greek for, belief and faith. But we often make a distinction between them. James does it, and he uses the verb form, which has to be believe, and the noun, and is always translated faith. And we sort of recognize, belief is this like mental assent. I agree in my mind that something is true, that something's a fact. And then faith is acting out in accordance with that. Well, this is where I think that this word, the NIV does a better job. He was amazed at their lack of faith. Because that's really what it was. It wasn't they didn't believe in him. It just says they definitely believed he was a great teacher with lots of wisdom, and he had miraculous power, right? It says that. They believed those things, but they didn't act in accordance with that belief. They didn't do what you would expect someone to do if they believed those things about him and believed what it said about his relationship to God, and they believed in God and what he wanted them to do. It just wasn't fitting together. And so you have that question again, why? Why this lack of faith in that sense? Well, you need to look at the context. As you begin to understand it, if you want to understand a passage at all, you've heard me joke, the three most important things are context, context, and context. And that is so true. Or it's so easy to come into a passage and just my first impression. Well, what have we seen so far? And really the context is the entire book of Mark in one sense. And the big thing we've seen there throughout Mark from the beginning is this contrast between a focus on the spiritual and a focus on the physical. Focus on God versus a focus on us, on faith versus sight, all of these things. And we've seen that Jesus, of course, has a focus on the spiritual. He came to preach about the kingdom. But the people have a focus on the physical to varying degrees. Even his followers, his disciples. You remember that first time Jesus goes out to pray and they're like, hey, Jesus, what are you doing? We got people for you to heal. They're focused on the physical. They're still focused on the physical in terms of the kingdom. And then we saw this other, as you move down the line, Jesus tells the parables. There's some people who are like, no, and they don't bother with it. There's others who come to Jesus. I'm interested enough, I'm open enough, I want to know the answer here. And then at the very extreme, you have the Jewish leaders who were so focused on the physical, they just absolutely, rejected the spiritual in terms of what they should have done. They lied about Jesus knowingly to the people, because they wanted to keep their physical position. So we've had that contrast. We've had that underlying theme in the whole book. And then, as I said, this passage, it's part of this whole section that started in Mark, where Jesus just keeps going back and forth, across the Sea of Galilee, and it's all linked together. Good literature does that. It uses physical locations to make changes and to tie things together. Well, so what have we seen? We look at the parable of the sower and the soils, and we've seen this idea of the word will have an effect and a result in us if we listen. If Jesus says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. If we truly hear, and that doesn't mean just process it physically. It means, one, to be open to it. All right, God, I want to listen to what you have to say. I want to be open to it. I want to examine myself in light of it. I want to surrender to you. And then when I see something, the second one is I commit to it. And I truly commit, not the shallow commitment that persecution is going to affect, not the distracted commitment that other things in life are going to swallow up. I'm truly committed to living it out. Well, then the disciples, they get in the boat and they go across, and the disciples are afraid of the storm. And Jesus says, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? The faith should drive that out. But then this other idea came up there that they realized after Jesus tells the storm to stop and it listens, it says they had this fear of Jesus. And we saw this fear, it's that idea of like fear of the Lord. It can be one or the other. I can either reverently draw closer to Jesus and surrender to Him, or I can withdraw from Jesus. Because of what we see in the next section where Jesus heals the man of the demons. And the people realize, wow, He's powerful. They don't understand all of who He is. He's powerful. If He sticks around, it's obvious He's above us. We don't want Him to stick around. Please depart from us. Please get out of here. They don't want to surrender to Him. In that relationship, it's clear. We are the ones down here. He's up there. We don't want that. We don't want to surrender, so please leave. And then we saw last week the Jairus and the woman with the blood. And they both have the faith. You know, the Jairus comes to him, Jesus, please come. My daughter's at the point of death, but I know you can heal her. That's faith. This woman goes through the crowd to touch Jesus. I just touch His garment. I'll be healed. That's faith. And for both of them, it leads to this fear choice. They're faced with fear. And am I going to choose the same things? Am I going to choose to withdraw from Jesus or humbly surrender to Him? You know, the woman tells all. Jairus, you know, Jesus even says, after the people come and say, your daughter's dead, don't bother the teacher anymore. Jesus says, don't fear, only believe. Would have been so easy for Jairus at that point. Well, I can't do it now. Jesus says, don't fear. Don't withdraw from me. No, surrender to me. Come closer. Continue to believe. So that's everything we've seen at this point. That should begin to guide our minds. All right, now let's look at this passage again and let's see. All right, what stands out here? What are some of the subjects in this passage? Well, it says he went away from there and he came to his hometown. That's pretty big. Hometown. It's the first time that we know that he's been here in his ministry years. That he's been here since he started his ministry. And so I'd put that down. You know, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue. And many who heard him were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? And so I'd put that down. Definitely a main subject here is his teaching and their response to it. They're astonished. They realize, they admit he has great wisdom. And they say, how are such mighty works done by his hands? So they recognize that as well. I'd put that down. Jesus' power is recognized by them. And then verse 3, and you could sort of tell this shift as you were reading. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us? Well, what's that verse conveying to us? These people know Jesus, don't they? He's the carpenter. I got a chair he made. Yeah, good chair. But he's a carpenter. Mary, I've known Mary all along, and his brothers are here with us, you know, and maybe some other people. You know, I used to hang out with Jesus when I was a kid, or my kids hung out with Jesus. And so you've got that idea of they know him. And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor. Prophet is honored everywhere. Except where? In his hometown, and among his relatives, and in his own household. So there's that idea again of hometown. Matter of fact, that word's repeated. You look for words that are repeated. His relatives, his own household. And we've seen even his relatives prior to this in the context. Like, hey, Jesus, you need to come with us. Things are getting a little out of hand. They didn't believe in him. And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And we said lack of faith. So he wasn't able to do anything mighty because they weren't following through on their belief. And so you take all those things together and you begin to look like, okay, those are all the subjects. What's the overall subject? What thing just keeps coming up over and over in this passage? And I'm going to ask you, because we found out a few weeks ago we can do that. So what do you think is the overall of those different subjects, like 5 or 6, there's like one of them that's repeated about 3 times. What is it? Which one? Faith is in there. That's what happens. But which one, where does it seem to stem from in their case? Because there's all kinds of times where people have a lack of faith, right? Like the Gerasenes, they had a lack of faith in the sense they believed he was powerful, but they're like, we don't want you around, which would make sense. You know, you just did something great for this guy. But their reason's different than what's here. What's the theme that came through over and over here? What's the word that's repeated a couple times? Hometown.
He's just like us.
He's just like us. We know him. We know his parents. We know his brothers. He's from here. He's from Nazareth. He's a Nazarene. Yeah, he's not, from some other big town where people are maybe more respected. And so if you had to encapsulate that idea of hometown, and is this not the carpenter, the person we know, and a prophet's not without honor except in his hometown, among his relatives, people he knows, I'd say the overall subject is familiarity. They're familiar with Jesus in ways beyond. It's not just they've heard of him. Everyone's heard of him. No, I knew him when he was this little kid. Again, I've got a chair he made. He's running around with my son, had a sleepover. All these things you can think about. And they would have known in a different way from anyone else. And that's unique as well. This is the first time he's been back here in his hometown. What's the point that's starting to get across? And that's where I put next as I go through this. And then, okay, what are the thoughts here that you start to see? Okay, how's this all playing together? The context, the subject, the overall subject, all of this. Well, again, people have been focused throughout Mark. They've been focused on the physical instead of the spiritual. And certainly have an element of that here. They're not open. That's what the parable of the soils was all about. You got to be open. I mean, if the seed won't even start to grow if you're the hard ground. I'm not even open to anything. And that's really where the people here in Nazareth are. They're not even open to this. The thing, they admit he has great wisdom. Nah, not going to listen to it. Why? Because we know him. We're familiar with him. And so that idea, even though you think about it, and this sort of gets me even with on the West Coast with the Gentiles, even though he could benefit them physically. Like, okay, yeah, I know him. My son grew up with him. But hey, if he can heal my daughter, if he could do this, you think at least they'd be open to that on that selfish physical side. But they aren't even that. And so they're faced with a similar, like we've seen these people, they're faced with a fear choice. They know Jesus is clearly from God. I mean, you listen to the things he said and then his mighty works. Again, Jesus did miracles, and throughout the Bible, this is the case. The miracles were done, yes, because the person, had compassion on the person who needed a miracle. That's true. But ultimately, the reason for miracles was to credential the messenger. If a person does a miracle, what's that mean? God is working through that person. This person is a messenger from God. And so they knew, and they're faced with that same fear choice. Here is someone who is clearly from God. Am I going to draw closer out of reverence, or am I going to withdraw? Am I going to surrender? Because if I come to him, it's obvious he's here and I'm here. Am I going to surrender or not? And what did they choose? Not. No. Makes total sense that you would. But they don't want to. Why? Because we can't humble ourselves before him. We know him. We've known him all this time. We know him so well. This lack of humble surrender. Why? Because he's one of us. He's just like us. So to me, and this is where there's not like one set, okay, these are the exact words God would use. But you come up with a lesson then. All right, what did God want us to get from this? And to me, it's the idea that familiarity can lead to a lack of surrender. Which is really a lack of faith, because faith is reliance on God and surrender to God. And so a lack of surrender, a lack of faith, which causes us to miss out on Jesus, his wisdom and his power. Again, here's this person, they admit, you're an awesome teacher, you can do great things. No thanks, we know you too well. Like, really? And so they miss out on Jesus. And you can apply that to people as we begin to then take that lesson, which is true for all. You know, none of us are from Nazareth. None of us saying, well, you know, okay, I don't know Jesus that well. I didn't grow up with him. No, but what can we learn? And I think sometimes today, for people that are, you know, have the potential to become a Christian, the lesson would be, you know, they're too familiar with him in the sense of a lot of people think, you know, I was born a Christian. You know, I was born in America, and at least it used to be a Christian nation. I was born in a Christian house. My parents, we always went to church. I'm a Christian. And, you know, you probably come across people like that. I come across people like that. They've never made the personal commitment. But it's just like, yeah, I'm a Christian. And so they're too familiar with Jesus, even though they really don't know him. It keeps them from truly knowing him. But it's not just non-Christians. I think of ourselves as well. And growing as a Christian, I think we can reach a too familiar point as believers that keeps us from actually knowing Jesus better and more. You know, longtime Christians know Jesus. We know his word to some degree, and that's good. You know, we'll never fully know him. And we should always continually seek to. I'm always reminded of Ephesians where it says, I want you to know the love of God that surpasses knowledge. I want you to know this thing you'll never fully know, so don't ever think you've got there. Don't ever check it off. Well, I know the love of God, now I can move on. No. We always need to know that more. We need to know God more. We need to know Jesus more. But can we get to a point that we're too familiar with Jesus? It's not that I know him too well, because we'll never know him well enough, but can I become too familiar with him as a believer? And it does something. It keeps me from being open. It keeps me from hearing. I become that hard ground. And not that I would ever say I refuse to humbly surrender. You know, we're a Christian. We can't say that. But it has the same effect. You know, the hard ground means the seed lands there and nothing happens. The birds snatch it away. Well, it doesn't matter if it's hard because I say I refuse to humbly surrender, or I don't realize that's what I'm doing, but I'm doing it anyway, right? The ground's still hard. So what's that look like for us as a believer? Well, I thought about it. I think sometimes it's the idea of we hear something and we say, yeah, but. Yeah, that sounds totally true. Yeah, I admit that's true. Yeah, that makes sense. But, and for whatever reason, you know, I've been doing it this way so long. You know, I've gotten by well enough for now. Things are going well. Let's not change things. Let's not rock the boat. And I have to admit, one thing that came to mind is what we saw, you know, a few weeks ago as we looked at, you know, there's some things in Mark where they had developed these man-made traditions and these opinions of what Jesus had said. There were clear principles, and then they gave application that were their opinions. And we talked about some of them that, you know, can be around churches, can be here. You know, men are the only ones allowed to serve communion. You know, men are the only ones that can, you know, lead songs because that's leading. Other things that happen in churches. And I look at that, and is there an element of, yeah, you're right, Steve, that totally makes sense, that's not, you know, a biblical thing, but. And then we rationalize. You know, but I don't want to upset someone. And I thought about that. I said, okay, I can understand that part, but you know what? When we act that way as the leaders of a church, there's other people in the church picking up a message. There's the young people in the church that are seeing, oh, that's what you do. You know, there's our phrase that we like to say, where the Bible speaks, we speak, where the Bible's silent, we're silent. But sometimes we're not silent. We add to that, and we rationalize it. Yeah, but. Well, the young people are seeing that and saying, where the Bible speaks, we speak, where the Bible's silent, we're silent, except when there's a reason not to be. In either case, not speak where it speaks, not be silent where it's silent. And we're teaching them, yeah, there's exceptions to that. Yeah, there's times when we do let these human traditions creep in and override things that are clear, when we add to it. And I think this is the same thing. Well, we're just so familiar with Jesus. Yeah, we're doing so much. We've done so much. I've been at it so long. It's been going this way for so long. Yeah. So we're not even open to things. Does that make sense? And it can be in whatever way it is for us as a believer, whatever thing that we're again, comes to us, and we just don't want to acknowledge. As I looked at this, and I always talk about a root problem, and to me, the thing that's underneath all of that, when we hear something new, and for whatever reason, yeah, but, is the idea of, yeah, I already am surrendered. I must be surrendered, or I'm surrendered good enough. I'm following Jesus good enough. Look at all these things I do. Here's one thing you mention. Okay, yeah, but I'm not doing that. But look at these other 5, 6, 7, 8 things I am. Was God up there like playing the percentages? And boy, I'm really hoping you score an 85 or better in life. No. We're told, be holy as I am holy. That's our standard. Because any other standard, it's pretty easy to compromise, isn't it? I'm better than I was. I'm doing a lot of things. I'm doing more than other people. I'm better than other people. If that's our standard, but that's why God said, no, the standard is be holy as I am holy, okay? Till you reach that, don't ever say, yeah, but. And I think that's there. And we don't even realize it. It's not even this, that we say, yeah, I know God wants me to do this, but I'm not going to because I'm good enough. I don't know that any of us would ever voice that. But I think that's what underlies some of these things. Yeah, we're doing enough as a church. Yeah, I'm doing enough as a person. And so, well, then how do we find it? If it's one of these things, I love my daughter saying, you don't know what you don't know. Well, how do we know what we don't know? Because by nature, we don't know what we don't know. And so we've got to step back, and this trait of humble self-examination, I think is just truly key to the Christian life. It's when Jesus was asked, who's the greatest in the kingdom? He brings up humility. Why? Because it's at the core. One of becoming a Christian, I've got to humble myself and surrender to God, but it's the essence of our Christian life. It's this humble, surrendered self-examination, this openness that was talked about in the parable of the sower and the soil. When the word is sown, even as a believer, I've got to humbly be open to it, or it's just falling on this hard ground. And so if I don't know that I'm hard ground, I've got to step back and examine, and I think one thing too, I've got to ask for some help in that examination. I've got to ask a fellow Christian, I've got to get together with someone and let's say, hey, let's be honest with each other. You tell me what you see, I'll tell you what you see, or I'll tell you what I see. And then, I don't know who wants to go first, but yeah. Look at situations. This whole growth triangle again. I look to the Word, I look at situations, I get together with another believer and look at both, the Word and situations. What do you see? Is there something where I'm just hard ground, where I'm like, yeah, but. And it ultimately comes down to this idea, I'm just so familiar with Jesus. That's what the but is. Some reason of, yeah, but I'm familiar with Him. I've done this much. I've been in church this long. We've been doing it so long. I'm doing all these other things except that. I'm familiar with Him. And so I refuse to humbly submit to Him. For me, as I thought about this, and that's part of this process as you go down, the general application, and then get specific. And the thing that came to mind when I first was preparing for this, it was shortly after, and it's not just this event, but some like that, it was the men's meeting up at the camp. And here I am, and I go hear a speaker, and there's part of me that wants to say, I'm pretty familiar with the Word myself. What am I going to get out of this guy? I know as much as he does. Maybe I know more than he does. Maybe I should be up there. Why is he up there and I'm not up there? I'm so familiar with the Word and Jesus that's in the Word. And that's how this temptation specifically hits me at times. And so I'm just going to close myself off to what's being sown there and miss out. I've heard it said, and it doesn't apply in that case of my own issue that I was dealing with, but anytime the Bible is read, it can be a lousy sermon. If they at least read the Bible, you can get something out of it because it's the Bible. I should always be open to that. It doesn't matter who that person is. I might know 10 times more than they do, but if they at least read the Bible, I should get more, and chances are they might have something in and of themselves that God's worked to open them to see. And I need to be open to it. That's my struggle, my temptation in this specific way. One of them, I could keep going, I'm sure. But I'd ask you to examine yourself as well, and that's what do I need to do now? And so ask yourself, about your response to any recent insights, and especially as we as a congregation have been looking at, Colossians and now Mark. Has there been anything that we've gone through and we've seen and you've had that response? Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, I really believe that's true. but, and you've rationalized. But here's why I don't need to follow through on it. Here's why I don't need to live it out. Here's why I think I'm living it out good enough. Has there been anything like that? Because that's exactly what this is. I mean, that's basically what these people said to Jesus. You are an awesome teacher. We're astonished by your teaching. You have great wisdom. You've done mighty works. Yeah, but we know you. Well, we grew up with you. We know your parents. We know your brothers and sisters. Yeah, but. And what happened? They missed out on Jesus and what he could do. Identify, the second thing, if there is something that you identify from the past or from this point on, make a decision. How will I respond? Am I going to continue in that same yeah, but? Am I going to continue to rationalize, continue to give some reason why I don't need to follow through on this, why I don't need to act in faith? Again, I believe this to be true. Well, if you believe it, faith says I act in accordance with that. Is that what I'm going to do next time something comes to mind? Am I going to make that commitment? Am I going to look back on something else and follow through? Because once again, the people in Jesus' hometown didn't. And it says there, the verse that, I guess in one sense this could be the one. He could do no mighty work there. That wasn't because his power was gone or faded or, they'd robbed him of it. He just couldn't because they were unwilling to allow him to be who he came to be. A great teacher and a person that demonstrating God's power, but for the purpose of telling about the kingdom and people being open to that, at least to some degree. Not getting it right away, we don't, but at least being open to that. If we're not open, if we're yeah, but, we're not going to experience his power as much as we might like what it would bring. And so here we come again to this point of decision. And it's that decision again. What am I going to do with this? And maybe you're here today and you haven't made that decision for whatever reason. And maybe as a young person, or maybe whatever your age, you've grown up and I've just been around Jesus so often. I'm really familiar with him. Yeah, but do you know him as your personal Lord and Savior? Have you accepted him and made this commitment to live for him? Sign the blank sheet. And then for the rest of us, again, maybe we didn't realize we signed a blank sheet. Maybe, I want to be forgiven and go to heaven. I signed that sheet. And we're coming to realize, wow, the sheet God put out there was blank. Yeah, he's going to forgive us. We have assurance of heaven. But everything in between, he's saying, be open to me and my truth. Commit to it fully, whatever it is. Whether it's easy, whether you like it, whether it goes against the crowd, live it out. Follow it. And so we're going to stand and sing our hymn of invitation, and that's the decision that we're all invited to make at this point.